and I'll upload the class later. Welcome back. Let us begin. We are studying Pirkei Avot from our extended study of Mishna, which is the core rabbinic text of the Jewish tradition that becomes the inner kernel of what will eventually grow into the Talmud. Let's say a blessing together for the study of sacred text. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you to the Holy One of blessing, who has made us able to immerse ourselves in sacred words, words of Torah. Let's also join together as we say a prayer of gratitude that we have arrived in a new year, still able to study together, albeit in a kind of distance format over Zoom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. We are grateful to the source of life for giving us life, for sustaining us, and for enabling us to reach this first class of a new year. Last time we gathered, it was late May 2021. Much has transpired in the world and in our lives and in our Jewish community. And at the same time, it probably feels like we're on this crazy hamster wheel where nothing has transpired and we're still doing the same thing we were at this time last year. Nevertheless, I hope you are safe and well and fully vaccinated and maybe even boosted. And off we go. When we last left Pirkei Avot, we had reached the third Mishnah of chapter 3. I'll bring it on screen momentarily. It seems that midway through chapter 2, the tight organization of the mishnayot, the individual teachings, which seem to be chronological through the generations of the early rabbis and their predecessors, that is to say their teachers, who were not called rabbis, but people, for instance, most famously like Hillel and Shammai, who are master teachers of the Jewish tradition even before the title of Rav or Rabbi became commonplace. And we would learn their teachings in the order of the history of the teachers themselves. So, in other words, we would learn about one teacher's teaching, and then we would hear that said teacher had disciples or disciple, and then we would listen to or read the teaching or teachings recorded in the name of each disciple and on down. Somewhere toward the middle of chapter 2, Pirkei Avot gives up on that format and becomes more of a loose collection of teachings attributed to rabbis who cross generations. We're still talking about a time frame of teachers extending from as early as the 1st century before the Common Era up to the first part of the 3rd century of the Common Era. So even Pirkei Avot is an anthology representing the better part of 400 years potentially of Jewish teaching. So, any thematic cohesion is probably an editorial byproduct. That is to say, if indeed it was Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, who compiled and redacted the Mishnah somewhere in the 3rd or 4th decade of the 3rd century of the Common Era, as is commonly held to be true, he probably had a bunch of source documents, and it's not clear to us 21st century readers exactly what organizational editorial principles are deployed to help the texts cohere into a whole of 5 chapters. Again, we've noticed a few themes that are carried from the very beginning to the end. The idea of the transmission of Torah and from generation to generation in terms of the master-disciple relationship is, I would say, a through line of Pirkei Avot. Even more broadly, though, these are texts that seem to have in common one master theme, which is what is the meaning of a life well lived Jewishly? or perhaps even more specifically, what is the meaning of a life well lived for a young, promising scholar? Right? This is a book by rabbis for rabbis, and therefore that should be taken into consideration. This is not really a text aimed at laity, though again, the difference between lay and clergy would have been very different in the Jewish ancient world. Rabbis were not paid professionals, they were simply the people who were regarded and venerated as the most qualified teachers and adjudicants of matters of Jewish law and practice. They held other day jobs, and this is an intention. I'm not just riffing off the cuff too much this morning, because the theme we're going to pick up right away as we dive into chapter 3, starting at Mishna number 4, is precisely about the balance, delicate or indelicate, between the pursuit of Torah and scholarship and the pursuit of what we might call a day job, earthly pursuits. And so we're going to look at the dialectic that comes up in Pirkei Avot between a life of spiritual or scholastic pursuit, and spiritual and scholastic are not quite synonymous, but they are siblings. And on the other hand, a life of material pursuit, and the interplay between those two pursuits and how a person should negotiate the demands of living in the material world and yet placing value on the pursuit and the study of Torah. And therefore, I return to my disclaimer, which is that this is literature by rabbis for rabbis, and it must be understood in that context, right? So if you read a line that, as we will, that suggests that one should not fritter away it would have been his, we can say his or hers, one should not fritter away his or her time, his days, or even more importantly, his or her nights, in anything other than Torah, we as quote unquote lay people might reasonably object to this premise and say, wait a minute, I got to feed myself and my family. I have, responsibilities to myself, my loved ones, and the world that will not be met if I spend all of my time studying Torah. That would be a reasonable objection, and I hope that you will actually feel that dissonance with today's text and openly talk about it. So that's my preamble for this morning, and I am just so happy to do what I'm about to do right now, which is share the screen. So we're going to look at chapter 3, starting at Mishnah number 4, Pirkei Avot, and let's dive right in. Here it is. So this is Pirkei Avot 3:4 at the top of the screen. And I'll start by, kind of introducing us to the person who is discussed here. Some of these rabbis are, I would call them well known to modern Jewish readers, and some of them are still more obscure. And it's usually just a matter of how prominently they figure in Jewish literature, not only in Pirkei Avot, of course, but also in other Jewish literature. So for instance, most of us have heard of Rabbi Akiva. Even if we are not rabbis ourselves, Akiva has a kind of fame that has accrued to his name. And there are legends told about Akiva, and there are so many teachings recorded in the name of Akiva or that reference Akiva. Whereas we may not have heard of this fellow, whose name is Rabbi Hanina ben Hachinai. Rabbi Hanania, it says here. That's very interesting. There's a discrepancy between the actual Hebrew and the translation that I just picked up. The Hebrew says Rabbi Hanina. If you're a Hebrew reader, you can see it's this word right here. And here in the translation, they call him Rabbi Hanania. Hanina and Hanania are effectively the same name. It's just one is an abbreviation of the other. Hanania would be Hebrew and Hanina is Aramaic. There's a tip-off, by the way, for all of you fellow linguists out there. if a word or even a proper name ends in an aleph, right? This is a chanina ending with an aleph. That's a signifier of the Aramaic form of a name. Aramaic names that end in the vowel sound tend to use an aleph, and Hebrew names that end in the sound tend to use a hey. But it's the same name, Chanina, Hanania. He probably went by both. Ben Hachinai. This is the only teaching I'm aware of in his name, but I'll probably pick up one or two more before we close out all of our 5 chapters of Pirkei Avot. So Rabbi Hanania ben Hachinai said, Haneor balayla vehamehalech bederech yichidi vehamifane libo levatala hareze mitchayev benafsho. This is a short teaching that's really hard to unpack, so we're going to do it a few words at a time. Rabbi Hanina or Hanania ben Hachinai said, Hanoer balayla. Laila is a word that you probably know because Laila is nighttime. And we say Laila Tov when we say good night to somebody. So Haneor balayla. So one who is aroused, but not sexually. One who is aroused from his sleep in the middle of the night. One who gets up in the middle of the night. One who wakes up. Brief digression. Any insomniacs here? Okay. Yeah. How many of you slept a clean 7 or 8 hours from when you went to bed till this morning? That hasn't happened to me since I turned 40. So I am referenced in this line here. Haneor balayla, the one who gets up in the middle of the night. V'hamehalech b'derech yichidi, and one who walks mehalech, like from lech lecha, right? Lech mihalech literally means to walk about, though. It doesn't just mean to go in a straight line. Like next week's Torah portion is lech lecha, go, but specifically go forward. Mihalech has an added valence in Hebrew language of walking around, one who's kind of ambling or strolling. So one who is strolling baderech, on the road, yichidi, by himself. Yachid means alone. It is linked semantically to the word echad, actually. So yachid, echad are connected. Walking by oneself, or walking around by oneself. A little bit directionless, perhaps, at night is what's implied. Viha mifane libo levatala, and it's not clear if this means all of these activities are happening at the same time. Right? Even to me, I've studied this text many times. I'm trying to come back to it. I'm saying, okay, is this the case of a person who gets up in the middle of the night and decides that the best way to deal with insomnia would be to go take a walk and have no real direction, and is walking by oneself outside at night while hamifane libo, turning his heart, where heart is usually the seat of thought in the Jewish tradition, right? If you see the word lev or libo, lev meaning heart, libo meaning his heart, one's heart, it does not mean the organ that pumps blood through the body. Lev almost always in Jewish literature, sacred Jewish literature, means conscience, consciousness, thought, right? So, which is why it's mistaken to say Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha means you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart. It actually means with all of your thought. Just something to chew on. And one who turns his thoughts levatala. Vatala comes from the root verb that means something that is null or canceled or void or empty. Right, so you're turning your thoughts to empty matters. They say here, idle matters. Not a bad translation. But I would have said, is thinking about frivolous or idle things. All right, so that's the scenario that's been set up. You wake up in the middle of the night and you decide that I'm going to go take a walk with no direction in mind by myself at night, and I'm going to think about nothing of real significance. Hare ze, behold, I don't like behold, I would just say, hey, look here. Ze, this one, mitchayev, This is where things get really challenging. This one has obligated himself, literally, binafsho, for life, for his life. Here they say is mortally guilty. I don't like that because the word guilt actually doesn't come up in the Hebrew at all. I would say probably the best idiomatic translation here, and this is really a stab in the dark by me, would be that person has his life is in forfeit. He is spurning his life, or he has. I mean, it does not. I think it should not be taken literally that he has committed a capital offense, an offense where the only punishment would be death. I would say it simply means that by doing this, he is forfeiting the worth or value of his life. A pretty strong statement, but remember, we're not talking to quote unquote lay people, a distinction that the rabbis might not have understood the way we understood it, nevertheless is meaningful. We're talking about advice given to young rabbis. So you're a teenage boy, the hormones are racing, and your master teacher, this fellow Hananiah ben Hachinai, who himself, I believe, was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. So you should, and he lived, by the way, during the 2nd century of the Common Era, which would be concurrent with Rabbi Akiva. And like Rabbi Akiva, he was among the rabbis who was rounded up, who were rounded up during the Hadrianic persecutions in the aftermath of the failed Bar Kokhba revolt, which was in the 4th decade of the 2nd century of the Common Era, like 135, 137. Just a quick sidebar, the Bar Kokhba revolt was an uprising led by a charismatic, self-styled messianic figure who had the public backing of Rabbi Akiva and other disciples, but especially Akiva, who was kind of the chief rabbi of his generation, what is often called the 2nd generation of rabbis in the rabbinic commonwealth. The 1st generation being the disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the one who got permission from the Roman Empire to set up a colony of scholars in Yavne. We studied him last spring. So now we're in the 2nd generation. So we're talking about the first, grouping of rabbis in the 2nd century of the Common Era. There was a 2nd Jewish revolt against Rome, the first one being the uprising, the Judean rebellion that led to the destruction of the Judean Commonwealth and the Temple in the year 70. And of course, whose famous or infamous last outpost of zealots was legendarily associated with the mountaintop fortress of Masada. Now we're another 60 years down the road. So it's not generations in the sense of 25 to 30 years. It's a rabbinic generation, meaning a whole new group of scholars has arisen to take their place in the chain of tradition. And we have this instance of a charismatic young Jewish rebel named Shimon Bar Koziba, who self-styles himself as Shimon Bar Kokhba, literally the son of a star. Stars in the sky point to the birth of Messiah figures, as in the Jesus story. So this is a common mythical literary trope that was known by the community at the time. So you have son of a star, Bar Kokhba, basically leading a military uprising against the Romans. It went very badly. It actually went worse than the Jewish rebellion in the year 70 or in the year 67 because it ended up in the total exile, expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem, and a further diminishment of Jewish sovereignty in what had been the Jewish state. So this was really, if you want to talk about the real full force of diaspora, of Roman expulsion of Jews from their indigenous territory, it was the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. In that context, you have rabbis teaching at great peril to their own lives and well-being, including the famous 10 Martyrs, who, under the direction of the Emperor Hadrian, were persecuted, tortured publicly, and executed. they are recalled as part of the traditional Yom Kippur afternoon liturgy. We didn't do a martyrology this year because we compressed and condensed our High Holy Day services to accommodate more services with fewer people at each service, as I'm sure many of you in our community are well aware. But you've probably heard of the 10 Martyrs. So this fellow, Hananiah ben Hachinai, was one of them. And so that's a very long sidebar. The only other thing, just returning to the main theme, is that this is advice for rabbis. So picture you have a kind of a adolescent young male who, like many young men, can't sleep through the night. And what are these thoughts? This is kind of like a little bit of thought police, but the master teacher, this Hananiah fellow, wants to advise his disciples: if you wake up in the middle of the night, maybe your thoughts are racing, you're worried about that big test you have in yeshiva tomorrow, maybe it's that girl that you keep seeing across the way, or maybe that young fellow, who knows. Don't think idle thoughts. Don't go take a walk, especially by yourself in the middle of the night, and we'll talk about that. Don't think about frivolous matters. The implied opposite is, of course, get down and study some Torah. Because if you think about frivolous things, you are frittering away your life, or you are forfeiting. Mitchayev has a kind of legal connotation. You have forfeited your soul. Okay, that's a long excursus. That was about 15 minutes on one short Mishnah. But now let's open it up for thoughts, questions, comments. Something came through the chat. I'll take a look. The message to me, writes one of us, is addressing one's waste of time. It is similar to the teaching that when two Jews meet, at least one point of Torah should pass between them. Yeah, and I think we actually covered that one. That may be in chapter 1 or chapter 2. And it's going to come up again. The next few texts are all kind of dancing around this idea of what constitutes a valuable use of one's time and what constitutes a wasteful use of one's time. Excellent. I agree completely. Ivan, a hand is up. Please speak. And then Steve Maskett, you'll go next.
Okay, but the last time when you referenced what we studied in May, surprisingly, the obligation to go to work, the obligation to feed a family, the obligation in addition to the religious thought and dedication. What if at night such an idle man may also think about what's my job tomorrow morning after breakfast?
Beautiful. Yes, thank you. Pirkei Avot, again, like all Jewish texts, if you seek 100% or even 80% or even 40% internal consistency, you will come away exasperated. A Jewish text does not tend to provide a whole lot of internal consistency. I talk more about constellations of meaning when I study Jewish text. If you look, for instance, at all of Jewish text and tradition in the aggregate, you can make a compelling case that Judaism is a tradition that is more focused on the here and now than the hereafter. That's a comment that I hear many Jewish exponents make, and I think they can make that compelling case. Yes, if you look at Jewish tradition in the aggregate, particularly if you're in dialogue with a study of Christianity, for instance, you can say that, relatively speaking, and maybe even absolutely speaking, Judaism is a tradition that is focused on how we live this life, not how we attain the afterlife and what happens in the afterlife. Having said that, there is no one Jewish text that is 100% consistent on that subject. Like, if you go to the Talmud, the Talmud is replete with references to the afterlife. It's just that I'm looking at the biggest possible picture and making a case from the constellations of meaning that there is more focus and more serious focus on the here and now as opposed to the hereafter. This is all an analogy. So yes, Pirkei Avot gives us conflicting views on, and I remember in my preamble I said this, the kind of delicate interplay between the pursuit of a living and the pursuit of spiritual attainment. And somehow they have to coexist. And by the way, Pirkei, you would expect this from a book that collects multiple rabbis speaking in different voices at different times under different historical circumstances. That's the other reason I referenced the fact that Pirkei Avot is anthologized from teachings that encompass at least 400, if not 500 years of Jewish learning. So how could we not expect for there to be a multitude of often competing or differentiated voices and teachings, right? Or competing is the right word. So, and hold that thought, Ivan, and hold that thought, class, because Ivan raised, I think, one of the salient lines of investigation for today's class. We're going to come back to it in about 2 mishnayot. We're going to come back to this. What exactly should be the proper balance between the material, the pursuit of the material, which is not a bad thing, by the way, although this Hanania fellow devalues it relative to the value of pursuing Torah. However, he's not just saying thinking about making a life or thinking about your job. He literally just says turning your thoughts to that which is null. So I don't know what that means. Like, mindfulness is a buzzword in many circles today, and as a person who has enjoyed the benefits of a daily, regular, usually twice daily practice of meditation myself, something that I've adopted into my life, having seen how important and meaningful this practice has been for Kelly, and she's very involved in a community of meditation and actually does work with and for them. Cultivating, I mean, there are overlaps between meditation and mindfulness. They're not really the same thing, but one of the benefits of these practices, be they a mindfulness cultivation or a regular meditation practice, is that one can have a better relationship with idle thoughts that do nothing other than increase stress in our lives. Right? Much stress is not actually about the circumstances of our life. It's about how we think about and how much of our hard drive up here is being devoted to things that elevate our stress levels. So I think there's an attunedness by this Hanania fellow to the deleterious effect of what they call mifaneli bo levatala, thinking about or turning your heart, that is to say your consciousness, your mind, to things that are null, things that are that have no intrinsic value, that can't possibly make your life better. It's not just thinking, so yeah, thinking about your big work project, that might not be a null thought. We'll come back to this. Steve Maskett, your hand.
So I was thinking about this section where the idea that a single idle thought could make you give up your soul seems not to ring right. So the way I'm thinking about it is that it's really a discussion about the importance of thought and the importance of thinking to the role of this group of people. And I'm wondering whether the reference to null thought is not idle thoughts, but possibly a strain of thought that is antithetical to the teachings that we're focused on, whether it's Gnosticism or some other thing that's out there.
Great.
So that it's what I'm thinking.
That's, I think, a beautiful coloring in and enhancement of the point that I would wish to make, that I'm trying to make myself. Yeah, lovely. Right, so we don't, there's not a whole lot of clarity, and there's not a lot of commentary on what exactly constitutes an idle thought here. What we know, and by the way, any of us who are familiar with the discomfort that has been generated in much of secular Israeli society about the mindset and the practices of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, this is a relevant conversation, because I believe that the case can be made that Haredi Jews have hyper-literalized and internalized this teaching specifically as a kind of overriding dictate for everything about how they organize their lives and their livelihoods. That is to say, that young men are disciplined from a very young age to believe that the only pursuit that is worth their time is the study of Torah, and that all other pursuits should be spurned. And what this ends up doing, and that women, by the way, because they are undereducated, even more, and not even in Torah, they're just undereducated in life skills, in academic and other life skills, and are expected fully to be homemakers presiding over a brood of 12, 14, 16, 18 children, where men are all day studying Torah. Well, where's the money going to come from? And what ends up happening is in communities like Kiryas Yoel, parts of Crown Heights, Machane Yehuda, and other enclaves in Israel, is you basically have a welfare state. You have just massive entrenched poverty and reliance on government handouts and the internal support network of Orthodox Jewish communities. Much of the resources of the Orthodox Jewish community, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in the States and in Israel, is dedicated to addressing the problem of men who do not work and women who are underqualified to work. So it's a huge problem. And I believe that some of that is rooted in an overly literal understanding of a text such as this, that seems to, if you take it at only face value, seems to militate against any kind of material pursuit in life in favor of you should be studying Torah all the day and all night long. Judy Gross, your hand. Just unmute yourself.
This seems as it's almost like a mind control thing. It's if you find yourself straying at all when you wake up, just get right back to God and Torah. Don't let yourself. It's just a warning. This is going to happen to you. Don't let it overtake you. Get right back to the thought, even in the middle of the night when your mind is wandering.
Yeah, and I will say that I have discovered there are more and less productive and soothing patterns of thought that can happen when I awake in the middle of the night. And there are some that will help me get back to sleep. There are some that will keep me up for a very long time. I've never actually deliberately tried to go and study Torah. There's also, by the way, this caution about walking around, not just walking in a straight line, but walking around on the road alone. And Bartanura, a medieval commentator on the Mishna, points out that this is because roads in the middle of the night alone are dangerous. So in other words, it is possible that some of this is not merely spiritually oriented, it is also pragmatically oriented. Like, of all the things you should not do if you have some insomnia and you wake in the middle of the night, don't go outside and walk around aimlessly on a road alone. And he references specifically bandits, but there's one other danger that the rabbis of yore seem to be particularly attentive to and concerned about, and that is demons. That the mazikim, these shadowy figures, might come and get you in the middle of the night. So there's a real concern about demons grabbing you in the middle of the night, and this is not the only place where you might see that. Karen?
Yes, I just want to underscore what you said a few moments ago. Different times, different rabbis, different ideas, different thoughts, and yet we're looking at this one particular of how you negotiate the pursuit of your responsibilities in the day and how do you negotiate Torah. And back in chapter, chapter 2, we read that Rabbi Gamliel completely doesn't agree with that, and that he thinks that the best way is to combine the both.
Right.
And he feels that if you do only Torah, that's a sin.
Thank you for the comment and the proper attribution, which was alluding me to Gamliel. That's great. Thank you. Mom and Dad, your hand.
I just want to follow up on that. Don't go out at night, because I remember when you were teaching about, well, this is in the light of the pandemic particularly, but now that Halloween is also coming up, about the Torah-itic injunction, when the demons are out, when the destroyer is passing over your home, the best thing to do is to stay inside.
Right. Yeah, this is consistent with a few other texts that talk about nighttime dangers. And as an interesting but meaningful aside, the entire beloved Friday night, not just Friday night, nighttime liturgy prayer, both weeknights and Friday nights and holidays, called Hashkivenu, is all about this, by the way. Hashkivenu is originally a bedtime prayer. And it's, if you look at the full text of a quote unquote Orthodox Hashkivenu, it says Hashkivenu is a causative verb, lehashkiv, with a kaf, which means to cause one to lie down. We don't have this in English. Like, lay us down unto sleep. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu lishalom literally means God cause us to lie down to peace or in peace, undisturbed, tranquil. And then the traditional prayer actually acknowledges all of the bad things that can get you in the middle of the night, particularly if you're not inside warm and tucked in your bed. It talks about bandits and various kinds of robbers. It talks about wild animals, and it talks about demons. And it also, I think, talks about disease too. It's like the nighttime is, of course, fraught with peril. So the best thing we can do is get in bed and then pray to God, Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom. And then the next line is Vaha midenu malkenu shomrenu l'chaim, and allow us to wake up in the morning unto life. You know, it was also, there are all sorts of fantastical associations with the meaning of sleep, where sleep is really like a little death. And that there's always this anxiety, hey, what if I don't wake up? So the last thing you should do before going to bed is pray Hashkivenu. So it was originally a homebound bedtime prayer that, like many homebound prayers, made its way into the Siddur and becomes part of the statutory synagogue liturgy. But its original context is, I'm going to bed now, God, keep me safe. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray, O God, my soul to keep. By the way, similar versification and thematization at the end of the Adon Olam. The final verse of Adon Olam is Biyado afkid ruchi, into your hand I commit my spirit, my soul. Be'et ishan ve'a'ira, at the time I go to bed, at the time I sleep, and when I wake. Ve'im ruchi geviati, but if my soul should expire, geviati, should I give up my last breath, Adonai li velo ira, God still is with me, and I shall not fear. So there are fears about going to bed that become encased in our prayers that you're probably not aware of because you're singing them and you're like, oh, what a nice song. It's like, yeah, well, I'm going to bed now, God. And these are things that are traditionally sung because you say, Adon Olam you can sing morning or evening because the line is, when I wake and when I sleep. But they both come from this kind of primal fear of the meaning of going to bed and the perils that can await one at nighttime specifically. And the Haggadah is filled with them too. There's that whole long piyut, that medieval poem, It Happened at Midnight. Like, that's when the angel of death, the destroyer figure my dad referenced, comes out and wreaks havoc. So, yeah, okay. So it seems that, you know, what Hananiah ben Hachinai is saying here is part of a larger collection of motifs around the perils of nighttime. One of which is that you might have insomnia, and that there are better and worse ways of dealing with it. There are ways that are more spiritually productive and ways that are more soul destructive. Okay, that's a good encapsulation of 2 lines of Pirkei Avot. Let's move on. Yeah, so is now I lay me down to sleep the same message? Absolutely. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray, oh God, my soul to keep. I don't even know where that comes from. Is it a nursery rhyme? Is it Christian liturgy? Maybe somebody who's more conversant with Christian norms and traditions would know this. Well worth looking up. Okay, so I'm going to put the screen back on so that we can look at the next text, which is longer but less complicated. No, sorry. Not less complicated. I'm looking at 2 different editions of Pirkei Avot, which slightly reorder the mishnayot, which is confusing, but there are lots of different editions of Pirkei Avot, and there's not 100% consistency, by the way. So sometimes you'll see something that quotes like Pirkei Avot 3:5, and it doesn't match what you have in your book. You just kind of have to look back or forth, and you'll eventually find it. Number 5. A fellow named Rabbi Nehunya ben Hakana. What are these other guys that, again, not particularly well known? This fellow, I don't know a whole lot about him other than that he is said to be a contemporary of Yochanan ben Zakkai. So like I said, we're no longer linked to any kind of discernible chronology of the teachers. So we're talking about a fellow who lived at the time of the original Roman suppression of the Judean rebellion in the later part of the 1st century CE, Common Era, 70s, 80s, contemporary of Yochanan ben Zakkai. It is noted that he lived a very long and prosperous life and is referenced in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud tractate Megillah, as having been noted for his particular generosity to his colleagues and his community. So, a mensch. Okay, Rabbi, let's see what he says. Rabbi Nehunya, there's that Aramaic aleph at the end. And by the way, Sefaria, the module that I use for teaching and for studying online, keeps getting better. I'll show you a little trick here. I don't know if you can see this, but you notice that when I float my cursor now over here, that a bunch of dots pop up under the name. Can you all see that? So when you are using Sephara on your own, this will happen. This is a new function. I noticed it last night as I was preparing my lesson. And now when you click on the name of a sage, you see how he came up in the sidebar there? And then you can read about Mr. Nehunya ben Hakana, lived during the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He directed his own academy and authored several prayers and laws. Highly respected by his peers, he attributed his unusually advanced age to his harmonious relations with others. So, okay, fairly consistent with what I tried to let you know about this fellow. And then you can just click here, is there a way now to actually get rid of this text? Yeah, you just click the X up here, and it closes it, and you're back to the master text. Cool, right? So Sefaria just keeps implementing new features to become more conversant with Jewish text, which I love. Rabbi Nehunya ben Hakana Omer, Kol ha-mikabel alav ol Torah. Again, simple words, very complicated meaning. Kol ha-mikabel, the syntax here means anyone who accepts, who receives. From like Kabbalah, kabel is a word that means to greet or receive or accept. So like Kabbalat Shabbat literally means welcoming Shabbat, to welcome, to greet, to accept. Kol ha-mikabel alav, anyone who accepts upon himself, accept with an ACC, right? Anyone who takes upon himself ol Torah. And ol is a yoke, Y-O-K-E, not Y-O-L-K. The yoke of Torah. This is not the first time that this phrase or this word has been deployed by the rabbis in association with Torah. Torah in the rabbinic literature is regularly described as an ol, or a yoke. Literally the same word that is described or that is used when talking about the thing that is placed around the neck and shoulders of a beast of burden, right? The thing that harnesses an animal. That is a yoke. Anyone who accepts upon himself the yoke of Torah, and we should really unpack the meaning of that. It's a very rich metaphor. And by the way, the more you explore this literature, the more you see how incredibly sophisticated the rabbis' writing is when it comes to how they think about, almost anything, and how facile the rabbis are with deploying metaphor to describe what they want to communicate. That is very important for modern, sophisticated, Reform Jewish readers because it polemicizes against anyone who claims to be a literalist when it comes to their religious literature. There's no way to read that phrase literally. There is no actual yoke of Torah. You're not taking a Torah scroll and harnessing it around your neck, right? So just pay attention to how elegantly and how adeptly the rabbis speak in metaphor. So the Torah is like a yoke. It's an obvious metaphor because it becomes absurd to the point of hilarity to think of it in literal terms. But the Torah as a yoke, that's very interesting, right? Like if I did an exercise with this class before we started today and I said, give me a metaphor for Torah, I'm willing to bet most of us wouldn't have leapt to yoke. Right? We would have used words that might, tree, it is a tree of life. Light, water, ocean, lots of water metaphors, river, stream, ocean. Like these are common metaphors for Torah. Sun. And then I could say, well, why? Why did you choose that metaphor? And you'd tell me. But lots of us, particularly Reform Jews, I think, chafe against Torah as yoke. So we'll come back to that. I'm going to read the rest of the text and then we'll unpack it. Anyone who accepts upon himself the yoke of Torah, ma'avirin mimenu ol malchut. All right, so if you put a yoke of Torah around you, if you accept the yoke of Torah, then you remove ma'avir from the word over, to pass, but in this case it's in the causative form, to cause to go away, to cause to pass, mimenu, away from him, ol malchut, the yoke of government. Right? So they remove from him. If you put one yoke around your neck, another one must go away. You can't have two yokes around your neck. Why? Not just because it's physically, it's a physical encumbrance. It's more than that. Because the purpose of a yoke, of course, is to steer the animal on a path, to do certain work, to plow a field, right? So you can't have two yokes on you because then you're driven in two different directions. This is all, by the way, I think very much thematically linked to the text we just read, though perhaps obliquely. Okay, so one who takes upon himself the yoke of Torah removes from himself the yoke of government and the yoke of Derekh Eretz, a very common phrase with multiple meanings. Most of you are familiar with, and I've said this before, Derekh Eretz because it's one of my favorite sermonics preaching subjects. Derekh Eretz literally means the way of the land, the way of the world. In modern Hebrew parlance, Derekh Eretz means common courtesy, right? I once gave a sermon where I basically used a famous Talmudic text that says, Derekh Eretz kadma laTorah, that common courtesy comes even before the Torah. Like, yes, we should be people who are in a deep relationship with Torah and mitzvot, but even before that comes something that is much more nebulous, but again, more important. Just be a mensch. Just be courteous. So I gave a whole sermon on Derekh Eretz, and I must have said the phrase 50 times in the course of a 20-minute sermon. And the next day on Rosh Hashanah Day 2 services, somebody, loving member of the congregation, came up to me and said, Rabbi, I just want to tell you, my family and I really liked what you had to say about, what is it, Derek Jeter? So, yes, Derekh Eretz, or as it is known in New York, Derek Jeter. So to put on oneself the yoke of Torah is to remove from oneself other yokes. One, the yoke of government, whatever that may mean, we'll unpack it with your input. Two, the yoke of worldly concerns. That's how they're using Derekh Eretz here. It does not mean common courtesy. It does not mean that if you accept the life of Torah, you have to become a jerk. That's not Derekh Eretz. This is Derekh Eretz in the sense of earthly pursuits, right? That's one of our master themes for today. That was my preamble. We've referenced it in the previous text. What is the relationship between a life of Torah and a life of Derekh Eretz? In the sense of worldly pursuit, not in the other idiomatic meaning of Derekh Eretz, meaning common courtesy. You following me? This can get confusing. Let's read the last part. V'chol haporek mimenu ol Torah. This is nicely organized, though. It's a fairly tight Mishnah. And anyone who breaks off porek, the yoke of Torah. So if you are already living a life bound by Torah and you cast that yoke off, notnin alav ol malchut, necessarily takes on a yoke of government ve'ol derech eretz, the yoke of worldly concerns. Okay, so it's a nice, neat, compact, if X then Y, if not X then not Y, right? It's a simple logic phrase. Okay, so let's stop can you just take an extra minute to absorb before I take the text off the screen, because I think that this is a fairly straightforward one, except possibly the, what do they mean, the yoke of government? And I'm happy to weigh in on what commentary might bring to bear on that unusual phrase. Let's start with my mom and dad, whose hand is up, and then we'll take it from there.
How would you compare this analysis or this kind of, I don't know whether it's actually an injunction, but it seems to suggest that if you're in the life of Torah, then you shouldn't or don't have to be in the life of government. So how would you compare this to like Islamic states where, you know, they're theocracies and where they actually enshrine their religious experts as the heads of government?
So where the question leads me is to an acknowledgement of the importance of context for a statement like Nehunya's here. It is evident to me that because there is a disconnect between a life of Torah and a life of government, where government, by the way, is not the best word, it's malchut, which literally means the realm or the kingdom.
Have a wonderful
It is
week.
clear to me
Thank you.
that because they are used in this text as antonyms, as opposites, right? That you have government on the one hand versus Torah, not both and, but either or, and that one replaces the other. That you're living in a context where the Jewish tradition is not the same as the sovereign power, right? So this is written specifically in a context of negotiating Jewish commitments and Jewish life against Roman authority. And that puts us in a very different milieu than a theocracy, an Islamic theocracy like Iran, for instance, where the government and the religious tradition are one and the same, and therefore there would be no difference for a member of the Islamic regime, according to the regime, according to the Ayatollahs. They're synonymous.
Yeah,
The
it would be-
malchut,
it would
malchut is the yoke of God's law.
it
God's
would
law
be
and
absurd.
sovereignty. So, but for the Jew here, for the rabbis, this is a very pointed statement that the world of secular concern, which is identified with Rome, though probably because they were afraid of censorship and worse. We know that within 60 years, the Romans are rounding up rabbis, torturing them, and executing them publicly, right? So that didn't just happen overnight. So they never will say Rome. They'll just say the government. And by the way, one of the commentators points out that involvement in the government could simply mean matters of taxation. Like, it doesn't actually mean that you're going to be working for the government. It could just be a kind of metonym where the government literally means anything pertaining to civil law and civil authority that Jews would have to be subject to. So if you're not going to be immersed in a life of Torah, if you are first and foremost loyal to Torah, then you are not particularly concerned with the government. But again, that's in contradiction to another master teaching from the Talmud, which says Dina de Malchuta Dina, literally in Aramaic, translated to English, the law of the land is the law. Which is to say, Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition, is very consistent that one should not be beholden to Jewish law in such a way that he is openly rebellious against secular law. Right? Jews are encouraged to be good, law-abiding citizens of any land in which they happen to find themselves at the mercy of the host state. Always, and that's why you don't have, and particularly post-Bar Kokhba, this becomes reinforced, right? Post-Bar Kokhba, the Jewish norm will become, don't make waves, be a good law-abiding citizen, even if it is not your way. Try to live a Jewish life within the confines of secular law. That will evolve, I think, out of the great difficulty that Jews have had throughout most of our history in antiquity through the Middle Ages up until really the present era, where the restoration of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel is a new norm. And I would say the ability of Jews to be fully fledged members of the modern nation state in the wake of the Enlightenment, late 18th, early 19th centuries, also opens up new avenues for Jews, though, Jews in government is a very recent phenomenon in anywhere in the world, relatively speaking. So I think there's this growing notion of Jews have to be very careful around the secular government, but at the end of the day, our laws, our standards, our Torah should be the kind of consistently present dicta that guide a Jewish life. And I think that's just very different from the modern Islamic nation state, which is by definition theocratic and autocratic, and where the whole idea is to merge Sharia, which is the Islamic word that means the same thing as halakha, it means the way or the path, with secular law. There is no differentiation. And that's why, it is, for an outsider looking in, one can accuse the Saudi government of barbarism for cutting off the hands of thieves. But that's Islamic law, and it is also secular law, at least according to one particularly stringent interpretation of Islamic law. Okay, Steve Maskett, and then Alan Markowitz.
So I'm going to accept that this is not intended to be a revolutionary statement of overthrow.
Thank you.
And-
That's a very nice. You've done two great jobs so far today of taking some very long discursive talk on my part and making it really compact and easy to understand. Yes, exactly.
Which,
This
by the way, is
not-
unusual for me. But
Well done. No, I agree with this. Is not a call to military overthrow, revolution, or armed insurrection. Go on.
I am struggling with the fact of the use of the word yoke for all three things, and whether yoke in each case possibly means something different. Because if it means abide by the laws of the kingdom, and if you're abiding by the laws of the Torah, you don't have to abide by the laws of the kingdom, doesn't make sense, right? So to me, the yoke of Torah, if we're talking to this rabbinic class, is not about the mitzvah system and the living of a life that leads to resurrection, which was, the real goal at that time, to get out of the struggles of these days, to know that it would be okay in the future. If it's really about the yoke that a rabbi is taking on, maybe it's, sort of this, it's like a temporal suspension. You're in a state of, the prophets talked about, in the prophets, we talk about how they're in this wild state of I forget the word that you would use.
Ecstasy.
Ecstasy, right. So maybe there's this state that you're put into when you take on the yoke of the Torah, and you're studying and you're thinking and you're not thinking idle thoughts. That's sort of where it took me.
Lovely. And maybe even more, after Alan's comment, I'm going to share something kind of fun and discursive or digressive, but intentionally, that I think is a modern voice, a contemporary Jewish voice from our time, that I think captures the essence of this text quite well. Alan, your thought?
Yeah, to me, it's a question of extremism. It's not an either or. It's at this time. For example, right now, the 20 of us are studying Torah, lowercase t. And at the same time, while we're doing this, we are not worrying about, as we would say in Yiddish, making a gutta parnusa.
Translate. I know the phrase, but translate.
Right. Oh, gutta parnusa makes a good living, good livelihood.
Gutta parnusa, right?
We're not thinking about worldly pursuits, but at the end of this session at 11:30, whatever it is, we'll go back to that. So it's not either or, but it's both as the time dictates.
Right. And again, I think that's why the government specifically is directly linked to worldly pursuits. It's in other words, it's not the government and or worldly pursuits. It is the government and worldly pursuits, meaning my worldly pursuits are effectively an extension of my relationship with the secular authority. And I will generate income, I will be responsible for taxation. That I think is, I have to be a citizen of a nation state. And that is what is juxtaposed in opposition to a life of Torah or a yoke of Torah. So here's the other Jewish voice that we're going to look at. And I just happen to have actually done my homework for this class, and I am pleased to be able to show you the text. Here's the text that gives us Minion of 10. So the story here is the 12 spies who have been sent to scout out the land of Israel by Moses at God's behest. And the spies, as you know, of the 12 spies, how many of them come back with a negative report about the land? 10. And how many come back with a positive report? 2. And who are the positives?
Caleb and Joshua.
Caleb and Joshua, right? Their names go down for merit. The other 10 go down in ignominy. So you have 10 spies who spread a bad report, not so much about the land itself, but about the people who live there, and they're going to eat us alive and we'll never survive, and we should go back to Egypt because life was so much better in Egypt. God hates it when Jewish people say that, by the way. God spent a lot of effort getting us out of Egypt. God gets really ticked off. And the Israelites do this all the time. When the Israelites are like, I liked it better in Egypt. That just really gets under God's skin, right? I don't blame God. That would piss me off too. Okay, so God says, and this is the context, right? God is really angry because you have 10 leaders of the community, not just schmoes, 10 tribal heads fully say, better for us to go back to Egypt. God is unhappy, and God says, Ad matai la'edah hara'a hazot. How much longer for this edah? Edah means a congregation, or it's a word that means a grouping of people, but specifically a group as a congregation. How much longer will this wicked congregation, asher hema malinim alai, keep complaining to me, or keep complaining about me? Malinim, disparaging, insulting me. I am really pissed off. And here, so what is a congregation? A congregation is 10. The 10 folks, they are called an edah. Ad tulunot b'nei Yisrael asher hema malinim alai shamati. Very well, I have listened to the incessant muttering of these complaining Israelites. All right, so that, and then God, of course, imposes on the community a punishment, which is, you're all going to wander in the desert for 40 years until the entire faithless generation dies off, even Moses and Aaron, save for Joshua and Caleb and the next generation to rise up after them. You, God says, will go into the promised land. The rest of y'all are going to rot in the wilderness. It's a very harsh punishment, and that's where you get 40 years in the wilderness. Okay, but the rabbis are playing midrash games here, and the hermeneutic is that they find the word edah, which means congregation. Edah here means 10, because it was 10 folks who complained. Therefore, God needs an edah to be a congregation. You wouldn't have expected it. You would have preferred 10 righteous in Sodom as opposed to 10 faithless complainers. But there it is. That's how Midrash works. It's not always what you want it to be, but it sure is fun. Okay, reading on in our text. One moment, I just have to flip tabs so that we can go back to Rabbi Chalafta. So Chalafta here, so that now we've proved that God is with the 10, but the rabbis want to make it clear that you can have God amidst a smaller congregation as well, right? There is Jewish life and Jewish spirituality without 10 people present. So the next verse, uminayin afilu chamisha. And where do you get that even 5? Like, again, Jewish texts, rabbinic texts tend to be very laconic. They have lacunae, or gaps. So literally you have 4 words here. Uminayin afilu chamisha, 3 words. And from where even 5? From where even 5? That means, from where in Jewish tradition can one conclude that even if you have only 5 people, that the Shekhinah, that God's manifest presence, that God's immanent presence dwells among them, right? Everything else is implied in the phraseology here. Shene'emar, as it says, from Amos chapter 9, Amos 9 verse 6. Va'agudato al eretz yesada. Literally, God's band or clasp. The word aguda means something that clasps, like a bracelet or a band. What God clasps over the earth, he has established. Very poetic. Like a lot of the prophets, it's just really hard to unpack, non-literally, not to be taken literally poetry. So I'll show you the line from Amos the way they translate it on Sepharia in a different place, of course. This is the text. Who built his chambers in heaven and founded his vault. Here they say the word vault. This is the word in question, agudato. God built his chambers in heaven, boneh v'shamayim ma'alatav, va'agudato al eretz yesada. But the rabbis will go on to say it is the same word for like a wristband or a clasp. So if you are clasping or grasping, it can also mean something you grasp with your fist. It can also mean a bunch. An aguda is a bunch. Anything that can be grasped with this. How many graspers do I have here? 5. It's very oblique. Yeah, I know Russell is rolling his eyes if he's still with us this morning. I'm sorry, because I know that, we would like it to be much more, a little bit better on the math. And okay, it's cute though. So it says, if you have an aguda, meaning that which can be grabbed, if you got something that is 5, then God is there too. Alan, I see your 5.
Is that the same agudas as in the movement Agudas Yisrael?
Yeah, the aguda, like Edah, is another word for congregation. Right? We've got many words in Judaism that mean in Hebrew that mean congregation. Edah, aguda, and when those words come up, the rabbis are inclined to say, okay, I know this word Edah, but how many exactly is an Edah? And they use midrash and the techniques that we're exploring here with a little bit of amusement and a little bit of an eye roll to suggest that an Edah means 10 or more, an aguda means 5 or more. And because both of those words pop up in other biblical contexts where God is there with an Edah in the story of the faithless spies, and God is there with an aguda in the prophecy of Amos, God is with 10 and God is with 5. All right? But there's more. So let's go down and finish this text today. Aguda. All right, the next part of the text I will call up on screen. It just is a matter of like flipping tabs. I'm not as bad at Zoom as I thought I would. I thought it'd be very rusty. All right. So that's Amos. Then it goes on to say, Uminayin afilu shlosha. Shlosha is 3. And from where even 3? From where do we get that even if you have 3 people studying Torah, so it's just my mom, dad, and me around the kitchen table, and we're talking Torah, how do we know that even then the Shekhinah, God's manifest imminent presence, can be among us? Shene'emar, as it says in the same psalm as before, Psalm 82, Bekerev Elohim Yishpot. Literally they say, in the midst of the judges does God judge. All right. So specifically, Bekerev Elohim, the word Elohim is an interesting word. It normally means God, but it also means judges. Judges are Elohim. How many judges are required to render judgment in a Jewish or rabbinical court? You know the answer because you're studying this text. It's 3. Where is the modern day application of that precept? When must I convene 3 rabbis in order to effectuate a Jewish judgment or a rabbinical judgment?
Bet din.
Bet din. A Beit Din, a rabbinical court, is convened with 3 rabbis, 3 Jewish authorities. Now, what are the 2 most prominent functions of a Beit Din in our Jewish lives? Let's say Reform Jewish life, but it goes beyond that actually.
Conversion.
Conversion is 1. I do not, as a singular rabbi, have the authority to preside over or validate a conversion. I got to get 2 other rabbis with me. By the way, we maintain this practice. Even for an infant. We did an infant conversion for the granddaughter of our wonderful congregant and fellow student. Sometimes she's in class with us, Judy Osterreich, over the summer. And I wanted to do that by myself, but I actually got an extra rabbi and a cantor because we need one in order to solemnize a conversion. What's the other one?
Give a get.
A get. Excellent, Judy. Right. The issuance of a get. Now, I am generally not qualified to issue a get, even a Beit Din of Reform. And by the way, any Beit Din that I convene will be subject to the scrutiny of Orthodox authorities who don't consider my Beit Dins legitimate Beit Dins. It's not the people, it's me. Because I'm not a legitimate rabbi in their eyes. I am a legitimate Jew, I'm just not a legitimate rabbi. And that can actually create problems because a conversion that is held under Reform auspices will not be accepted universally in the Jewish world. And the problem has nothing to do with the convert. It has everything to do with the Beit Din. Even if they go to the mikveh, even if they do all of the rituals, if the Beit Din is not orthodox, and sometimes even not orthodox to the stringent standards of the Orthodox authorities who are making these decisions, often in Israel or in other communities, then it's not a valid conversion. But that's a sermon for another Shabbos. Today, what I want to highlight is that 3 is where you judge, and therefore if God can be seen among the judges, that means God can be found among 3. You with me? Rabbinic math here. 2 more, here we go. Okay, uminayin afilu shnayim. Nice rhymey phrase there. And from where even 2? From where do we get that God can be found even among 2? Well, of course, there's going to be a proof text here. Shneimar from Malachi Gimel, from the prophet Malachi, chapter 3. Az nidberu yirei Adonai ish el re'ehu. So literally, and then those who feared God, one spoke to his fellow. Vayakshev Adonai vayishma, etc. Which literally means, and God saw, and God heard. Okay, so again, the text is from the prophet, among the congregation of the God-fearing, one spoke to his fellow, God saw, and God heard. So how many people are involved when one is speaking to one's fellow? 2. Okay, there's your proof text. God can be found even among 2. And then finally, you know where this is going, right? Can you guess? I'll bet you can. Uminayin afilu echad, and from where even 1? Shneimar, as it is written in Exodus 20, Shemot Kaf. B'chol hamakom asher azkir et shemi avo elecha uverachticha. In every place where I shall recall my name, or where my name is invoked, I will come to be among you and bless you. Here's the translation here. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come unto you and bless you. So, do you need a minion to have God with you? No. You need a minion for certain statutory Jewish prayers and activities. You need 5 to be an agudah. You need 3 for a Beit Din. You need 2 for a Jewish conversation. But you only need 1 person to think about God and speak in godly ways, and God will come to be with you. And again, some of this is all about the power of thought to lead you on a godly path. And I think that's what makes this text consistent with the ones that have come before it, though it's kind of a nice digression. Like I said, once you get into chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot, it becomes harder to discern a meaningful pattern that causes the text to cohere in a certain order. And that's going to be where we'll conclude for today. I will take any final questions before we wrap up, but I'm determined that we're going to try and make these sessions 90 minutes even. Judy and Ivan.
Okay, so I don't want to go all the way back to the Fertile Crescent, but I can tell you, and you probably have seen those fabulous books written in Babylon that existed, with the idea of selling. To me, it's a fascinating question. Why did the Jews survive when all the other empires did not? And what lessons did the Jews who survived got from the collapse of one enemy after the other, one empire after the other?
Yeah.
To what extent that strengthened, both in the rabbis or the ancient leaders, the belief that God is with us and not with the other side, i.e., where are they? They're in the dust. And then, of course, could they have survived? And the final question is, what is the threat today for the survival of the Jews in a more benevolent world?
Beautiful. It's a beautiful and provocative line of question here. I will say that there are so many secrets to Jewish survival, some of which I'm sure are by design and many of which are just, mazel, or divine providence, depending on how you want to understand mazel. And also, it's a little bit disingenuous to say that the Jewish people have been, favored with mazel throughout our history. Because on the one hand, we have a remarkable record of survival against the odds. On the other hand, we have an absolutely, astonishing record of suffering, almost unlike any other people. So it's hard to say. I think that, the rabbis, though, again, were acutely aware that the modality of Jewish life had to shift in dramatic ways away from temple sacrifice and ritual and physical presence in a community to the kind of spiritual pursuits of Torah, good deeds, and even thought. Like a lot of our texts today have been about the power of thought to effectuate an outcome. I think that's fascinating, by the way. We don't tend to think of Judaism as one of the world's great spiritual contemplative traditions. From texts like this, there may be a stronger case to be made in that direction. As for today, it's clear to me that the Jewish world is not in a position of uniformity on what will be the mechanisms that will best ensure Jewish survival. There's a lot of talk about anti-Semitism as something that has to be combated and fought. There's a lot of militaristic imagery that is associated with the current position of the Jew against, I would say, that's the right preposition, the world. And particularly when it comes to Israel. I am more of the mind that it's a both-and approach. I would not trade in the Jewish people's material prosperity in the West and sovereignty and military strength in the Middle East for our historical position of relative powerlessness. And I said that on Rosh Hashanah, by the way, in my sermon, quoting Bret Stephens largely, but it's a statement with which I robustly agree. On the other hand, if I am pressed and somebody says, Rabbi, what's the best way for us to address anti-Semitism? I would probably still come back to live a rich and meaningful Jewish life, would you please? Because otherwise, what are we actually preserving here? What are we actually defending? What are we fighting for? If we don't care about Judaism, if we care only about survival, let's all go survive together has never motivated me. And this is not 1945. Whatever else you may think about the perils of the world in which the Jew presently lives, this is not 1945. It's not 1933. It's not 1923. It's 2021. And we should use the advantages of our material advantage in the West and our material / especially military / sovereign advantages in Israel to create a more meaningful scaffold for living robust, joyful Jewish lives. But, I'm a rabbi. Of course I'm going to think that. So thank you. We'll talk more about this in the week and weeks to come. I hope to see you over Shabbat one way or another. I hope to continue to see you on Zoom on Thursday. Bring a friend. Can't wait to share more learning with you. God bless you for coming and coming back. So good to be with you.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Baruch Tiyeh. Bye, everyone.